I had spent the morning straightening the house, arranging the living room just the way Hayden liked it when he was a kid, thinking this family day might finally be different. At 55, I had grown used to doing things on my own, raising my son without support from his father, managing bills, jobs, and the quiet heartbreak of feeling overlooked by the people I once trusted most. Still, I had hoped that this day, just one simple family gathering, would remind him that I had always been there, that my sacrifices mattered. Hayden walked in, his expression tight, carrying a tension that immediately set my nerves on edge. I smiled, trying to catch the easy warmth I remembered from years ago. Instead, he crossed his arms and said it in a voice that carried the judgment of our parents as much as his own. Being a single mom is a family disgrace. You're not even invited to family day. The words struck me like a slap. Shock froze me for a moment. Then humiliation and simmering anger settled in their place. I looked at the son I had raised, the man I had guided through school, sports, and every heartbreak, and felt a surge of disbelief. How could he say that? How could he repeat the same narrow judgments I had endured from my own parents for decades, now turned against me? I forced myself to swallow the sting, to breathe, to remind myself that how I responded next would define the day, and maybe even the next few years of our relationship. As I set the teacups down with deliberate calm, I realized the confrontation was unavoidable, and it would start sooner than I expected. I had barely recovered from Hayden's words when my phone chimed. An email from my parents, Richard and Marianne, appeared in my inbox, and I knew before opening it that it would only make the sting worse. Their message was formal, distant, and utterly aligned with Hayden's judgment. They emphasized family pride, the importance of appearances, and subtly suggested that my choices had brought embarrassment to the family. Every carefully chosen word felt like a verdict against me. As I read, a mixture of disbelief and betrayal settled in my chest. Decades of raising Hayden, of holding our little family together after the divorce, of countless sleepless nights and endless compromises, seemed invisible. My contributions, my sacrifices, all dismissed as if they never mattered. My parents had always placed their own image above empathy, but seeing them side so explicitly with Hayden, who had just insulted me, made the world feel smaller and colder. I closed my laptop and sat back, running my hands over the worn armrests of the chair I had bought when Hayden was still in high school. I had prepared for disappointment. Yes, but never like this, never so public, so validating of my own humiliation. The betrayal fueled a determination I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about family day. It was about respect, boundaries, and the recognition I had earned but had never received. I knew that the next steps would require careful thought and strategy, and that the confrontation I had been avoiding would now be unavoidable. I stood, straightened my shoulders, and began planning exactly how I would respond. I retreated to my home office, closing the door behind me and letting the quiet of the room sharpen my focus. Hayden's words and my parents' email replayed in my mind, each repetition a reminder of the disrespect I had endured for years. I pulled out the list of family day preparations, a folder of receipts and emails I had kept meticulously for weeks. The venue booking, the catering, even the small gift I had planned for Hayden, all of it was under my control. And I realized that control was now my leverage. I went through each item deliberately. The venue had a non-refundable deposit, but the contract allowed for cancellation under certain circumstances. The caterer could be contacted with a polite explanation, and Hayden's car repair, which I had generously covered as a surprise, was an easy and immediate adjustment. Each decision was measured, proportional, and carefully considered. I was determined to respond in a way that preserved my morality and avoided cruelty. yet made it unmistakably clear that I would not be treated as invisible or disposable. As I mapped out the sequence of actions, I felt a strange sense of calm. Planning became a tool, a quiet empowerment. I imagined the moment Hayden would realize that his words had consequences, not in anger or humiliation, but in a clear, deliberate, and inescapable way. His car repair, a small but meaningful gesture I had provided, would be the final piece. A subtle twist he wouldn't anticipate. It was a small reflection of justice, proportional to the disrespect I had faced. I reviewed the plan once more, visualizing each step: cancel the venue, notify the caterer, adjust Hayden's car appointment, then calmly confront him and my parents with the results. Every detail had to be precise. The timing, the tone, everything mattered. With the sequence clear in my mind, I leaned back in my chair and let out a quiet breath. The confrontation was coming, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready. And I knew that what I had planned would make the message unmistakably clear. Tomorrow, I will act. I called Hayden into the living room, my voice steady even as my heart hammered beneath the calm surface. He hesitated in the doorway, a flicker of uncertainty passing across his face, but he stepped in, eyes wary. I gestured for my parents to join us, and the air grew thick with anticipation. It was time to address what had been festering for far too long, and I would not let it pass without acknowledgement. I began, measuring each word, controlling the rise and fall of my tone. Hayden, I said, you called me a disgrace. You told me I'm not invited to family day. And your parents, I turned to Richard and Marianne, have backed you up, prioritizing appearances over truth. Hayden opened his mouth, but I raised a hand and continued. I have spent decades raising you, supporting this family, making sacrifices you cannot imagine. And yet, when I need respect, I am met with judgment and exclusion. A tense silence followed, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Hayden's shock was evident. The words he had thrown at me now hovering uncomfortably in the room. My parents' faces reflected a mix of incredulity and irritation, unaccustomed to being challenged so directly. I took a deliberate breath and delivered the line I had rehearsed countless times in my mind. If I am not welcome at family day, then neither of you are invited, and the consequences for this disrespect will be clear. The room remained quiet, everyone processing the weight of what I had said. Hayden's jaw tightened, realizing the seriousness behind my calm, deliberate words. My parents exchanged glances, the shock that their own long-held values had collided with my unwavering assertiveness sinking in. I held their gaze steadily, projecting the certainty I felt inside. This was not anger. This was control. This was decades of patience and resilience crystallized into a single, unyielding moment. I knew I had drawn a line that would be remembered, one that set the tone for everything that followed. As I turned to leave the room to make the necessary calls and adjustments, I felt a quiet satisfaction settling in. The next steps were in motion, and Hayden, along with my parents, would soon understand that words had consequences, and respect was earned, not demanded. I picked up the phone and dialed the venue's number, letting the familiar hum of the line steady my thoughts. The receptionist answered promptly, her cheerful tone a stark contrast to the tension I felt. I took a deep breath and explained the situation, carefully choosing my words so that it was polite, but unmistakably final. I'm afraid we need to cancel our booking for family day, I said, and I apologize for the short notice. As I spoke, I kept my voice calm, neutral, each syllable deliberate. I didn't allow anger or frustration to creep in, because this was not about lashing out. It was about taking control, asserting boundaries, and sending a message without cruelty. The receptionist read back the cancellation details, mentioning the deposit and politely outlining the refund conditions. I noted each point mentally, making small adjustments where possible to minimize financial loss. But the message remained unchanged. Hanging up, I felt an unexpected lightness, a relief that came from exercising agency over a situation where I had previously felt powerless. For decades, my life had been a series of compromises, my efforts unnoticed, my authority questioned. Today, that shifted. This small act, seemingly administrative, carried moral weight. It was validation of my own worth, a quiet declaration that I would no longer be disregarded. A part of me lingered on the risk the deposit might be forfeited, my careful planning disrupted. But even that uncertainty couldn't shake the satisfaction of having acted decisively. I recognized it for what it was, a minor complication in a much larger assertion of self-respect. Each call I made, each adjustment I enacted, reinforced that I was capable of standing my ground, regardless of familial expectations. I leaned back in my chair, letting the moment settle before moving to the next step. The caterer would be next, and Hayden's car repair would follow. Each action carefully sequenced, each consequence deliberate. The path was clear, and I felt the surge of quiet power that comes with knowing your own life and choices are fully in your hands. Tomorrow, I would ensure that every piece fell into place exactly as I intended. I picked up the phone again, this time dialing the catering service for Family Day. My hands were steady, my voice measured as I explained that we would no longer need the scheduled meal service. I kept the tone polite, professional, leaving no room for negotiation, no hint of resentment, only certainty. Each word carried the weight of years spent unnoticed, of sacrifices made quietly and without acknowledgement. As I confirmed the cancellations, a quiet satisfaction settled over me. For decades, I had prepared countless meals for family gatherings, holidays, and birthdays, often at my own expense and effort, ensuring that everyone else's comfort and enjoyment came first. The irony was not lost on me that now, when recognition might finally matter, I was asserting control in the simplest yet most potent way. I imagined my parents' reactions, the subtle shock of realizing that their assumptions of compliance had been misplaced. Their dismissal of my contributions had never accounted for the possibility that I would act deliberately, proportionally, and without anger, but with unmistakable authority. The tension in the room when they would eventually grasp the consequences would be palpable, and I allowed myself a small, quiet acknowledgement of that. I made notes for the next steps, mentally moving through Hayden's car repair and the adjustments I would need to communicate to him. Each decision was a measured statement. Respect must be earned, and actions have consequences. I could feel the narrative shifting, the balance of power subtly realigning after years of imbalance. The phone clicked shut, the finality of the cancellation lingering in the air. I leaned back and considered the larger picture, the chain of events I had set in motion, each one reinforcing the message that I would no longer be dismissed or underestimated. The coming confrontation and its fallout would be unavoidable, but for the first time, I was confident that I controlled not only my responses, but also the pace and impact of the lessons they would learn. The next step required precision, timing, and resolve, and I was ready to follow through with the final piece that would leave no question about the consequences of their disregard. I took a final call that afternoon, this one directed at the auto shop where Hayden's car was scheduled for repairs. My voice was calm and measured as I explained the cancellation. There was no anger in my words, no reprimand, only clarity. The service would not proceed, and any questions about payment could be directed to me. But the appointment was officially off. Hanging up, I felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from exercising agency in a situation where I had been sidelined for years. Hayden had never anticipated this. The removal of something he assumed would be granted automatically, without thought or consequence. It was a simple action. Yet the impact would be immediate and undeniable. When I told him later, his shock was instantaneous. The color drained from his face, and his confident, dismissive tone faltered. "Wait, you canceled it." Why his words were a mix of disbelief and growing understanding. The gravity of his earlier judgment finally sinking in. I met his gaze steadily, refusing to soften my stance, allowing him to feel the weight of his own words reflected back. My parents' reaction was equally telling. Their expressions shifted from disbelief to recognition. They could see, perhaps for the first time, that dismissing my role came with tangible consequences. The lesson had arrived without me raising my voice or showing temper. Control, precision, and resolve had spoken louder than any argument could. I sat back, a subtle sense of relief settling over me. The worst of the confrontation was behind me, and yet the message was clear. Respect was not optional. Hayden and my parents would have to reconcile with that fact, and for the first time in years, I felt a measure of quiet empowerment, a hint of the emotional resolution I had long sought. The final act was still to come, one that would cement boundaries and ensure the dignity I had claimed endured beyond this single confrontation. I sank into the chair by the window, letting the afternoon light wash over me as I considered the series of actions I had taken. The venue was canceled, the catering adjustments made, and Hayden's car repair off the schedule. Each step had been deliberate, measured, and proportional. And for the first time in years, I felt the quiet satisfaction of having acted on my own terms. Yet beneath the calm was a lingering sadness. Decades of effort, of caring and providing, had brought me to this point. I had spent years hoping for acknowledgement from my parents, and, in a different way, from Hayden, that hope had been met with dismissal and judgment. And while my actions had corrected the balance, they could not erase the pain of years spent undervalued. I thought of Hayden, my son, still processing the implications of what had occurred. My pride in his growth and potential clashed with my disappointment in his lack of awareness. I loved him deeply, but love did not negate the need for boundaries or respect. For too long, I had allowed my own feelings of obligation to override the necessity of self-preservation. Sitting there, I recognized the empowerment that came from standing firm. I had acted without malice, without spite, but with clarity and purpose. My dignity had been restored, not by others' approval, but by my own deliberate choices. I allowed myself a quiet, reflective smile, understanding that the coming days would test the permanence of these lessons. And yet I felt ready. The boundaries I had set, the consequences I had delivered, were only the beginning of a new chapter. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of ensuring that respect and autonomy were no longer negotiable, and that the lessons of this confrontation would be fully absorbed. I called Hayden and my parents into the living room once more, not with anger this time, but with a sense of calm determination that carried the weight of everything that had led us here. My voice was steady as I spoke, laying out the boundaries that would guide our interactions moving forward. Respect is not optional, I said. Financial support and privileges you've received in the past were never guarantees, and moving forward, they will be contingent on behavior and acknowledgement of effort. Hayden shifted uncomfortably, clearly weighing the seriousness of my tone. He had seen the consequences already, but now I was framing the expectation, not just the punishment. Family gatherings, events, and shared resources are privileges. I continued. If I am excluded, I will not continue to accommodate those who disregard me. This is about respect, not revenge. Turning to my parents, I made the point clear that their continued support of Hayden's judgmental stance would have consequences as well. The same rules applied involvement would be limited unless mutual respect was demonstrated. The room felt heavier, but the weight was one of clarity rather than conflict. I had spent too many years allowing assumptions, obligations, and outdated loyalties to dictate my decisions. Now, everything had shifted. I also took practical steps behind the words. I reviewed all financial arrangements, ensuring my accounts were secure and that Hayden's privileges could not be accessed without consent. I set guidelines for communication and visits, making sure that future interactions would not allow for automatic assumption or entitlement. Each measure was both symbolic and functional, a reflection of the internal growth I had achieved. For the first time in years, I felt fully aligned with my own authority. The confrontations, the cancellations, the deliberate steps I had taken, they were not about punishment. They were about reclaiming agency. My family would have to adjust, and Hayden would have to learn the value of respect through clear and consistent boundaries. With the framework in place, I allowed myself a deep breath and a quiet sense of resolution, knowing the final chapter would mark the true beginning of autonomy and emotional balance. I sat at the kitchen table that evening, the house quiet now that the day's tensions had settled. The cancellations were complete, the boundaries clearly stated, and for the first time in years, I felt a profound sense of control over my own life. The weight of constant accommodation, of bending to expectations that had never acknowledged my sacrifices, had finally lifted. Hayden lingered nearby, hesitant, clearly processing the impact of what had occurred. His expressions shifted from frustration to contemplation, the lessons I had set into motion beginning to take root. I could see, in subtle ways, that he was starting to understand the importance of respect, that privileges and assumptions were not automatic, and that his words carried consequences. The dynamic between us had changed irreversibly, but there was space now for growth, reflection, and possibly reconciliation on new terms. My parents had retreated to their own routines, subdued by the clarity of the boundaries I had established. Their expectations, so long unchallenged, had been recalibrated by the reality I now embodied, one of self-respect, agency, and unwavering authority over my own life. I allowed myself a small smile, acknowledging the quiet victory. This was not about revenge. It was about autonomy, about finally taking ownership of the life I had sustained through years of challenges. The past could not be rewritten, but the future was mine to shape. As I rose to clear the last of the evening dishes, I felt the subtle thrill of possibility. The house felt different, lighter, and yet charged with the tension of what might come. Respect had been asserted, independence reclaimed, and dignity restored. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but I was ready. The family dynamic had shifted permanently, and I was prepared to navigate it on my own terms.